Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third annual Boise Neighborhood Interactive. We're all excited to have you here. We are going to be discussing today the bridge of the apparent cultural divide between developers and neighborhood residents. This deck was created by the Urban Land Institute, Idaho District Council, and the idea of this workshop is to provide a greater understanding of the real estate industry's role in the development of our homes, our neighborhoods, and our cities. So the Urban Land Institute is an international organization whose mission is to provide leadership in the responsible use of land and in creating a sustaining, thriving community worldwide. The Idaho District Council of the Urban Land Institute has nearly 250 members that are across Idaho and Western Montana. And we've been gaining momentum and growing on a local and state level for the last couple of years. After you review this workshop, if you have any interest in getting more involved with ULI, we welcome you reaching out to any one of the panelists. From there, I would like to talk further about our presentation topics. So as a quick overview, we are going to go over the public and private objectives for development, the public and private steps in the development process, the overall business of real estate, the importance of integrated planning process, and how we can all learn to work more effectively together. To start out, I will be introducing all of our panelists, and then we will be going right into our presentation. To start, I'll introduce myself. My name is Jessica Durham. I'm a residential real estate advisor. I've been working in the Treasure Valley for 15 years, primarily working in single-family real estate sales and marketing. Through ULI, I currently serve on the ULI Management Committee and as the Next Program Chair and the Women's Leadership Initiative Co-Chair. Up next, I'd like to introduce to you Shellen Rodriguez.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't find my mute button there for a second with my two screens. Hi, I'm Shellen Rodriguez. Thank you for the introduction, Jessica. Currently, I run my own company. It's a small development consulting firm, SMR Development. Prior to that, I was working in both the public and private sectors. I worked for over 5 years at Boise's redevelopment agency, CCDC. And prior to that was with, spent over about 15 years doing multifamily and affordable housing development for-profit, nonprofit, and quasi-government organizations. So my background is truly in real estate development. ULI has been an important part of my career, starting out as a young leader and now member of the Next committee. So that I would also urge, I would kind of echo Jessica's sentiment that if you are interested in land development, the Urban Land Institute in Idaho has been a really great opportunity. So I think next up is Patricia.
Hi, everybody. I looked at the participant list and I think I know about half of you. So it's good to see you virtually interested in the topic. And my name is Patricia Nelson. I'm currently the Development Services Director for Canyon County. I've been here about 7 years, and I did work at the city of Boise before then for about, I think, 7 years. I was the project manager on Blueprint Boise. So I have a pretty good knowledge of the city, and I am a resident of Boise City still. I do the bi-coastal commute every day. So I have been a planner, private or public sector planner for, sad to say, 35 years. So I'll be talking about integration with the planning process.
Wonderful. And next we have, last but not least, Ryan Armbruster, who will introduce himself, and then he will dive right into his portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Jessica. And thanks to the City of Boise and the Boise Neighborhood Initiative for inviting us to this program, and both Alexandra and Melinda to have gotten us through this technological challenge. You know, certainly the program that you're going to see is one that has been used by quite a veteran group of attorneys, developers, and ULI members. This is really kind of not our maiden voyage, but pretty close to it. So bear with us as we go through this. Certainly, we would have very much preferred to have had the opportunity to meet with you in person, but of course, COVID has moved us into this technological platform. There will be time for questions and answers, and Alexandra is going to coordinate those for us. So a little bit about myself. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Elam & Burke here in Boise. I've been a practicing attorney for over 40 years. My first stop in my career was as a deputy city attorney in the city of Boise. I was there for 3 years, and ever since I've been here at Elam & Burke. I have been fortunate to have seen both sides of the equation, both on the private side and the public side. And I've actually been able to see a project go from just an idea to a final product, which has been very nice to see as we've gone along. You know, certainly as a lawyer, I have to provide this disclaimer. I'm not here to give any particular legal advice, just trying to provide a little bit of an oversight as to how all this process works. So even though we're in the midst of a pandemic, which has impacted development, the economy, and so many things on so many fronts, but based on information that the ULI has pulled together from various component parts of our state, it does appear that Idaho will continue to grow, continue to develop, and has an opportunity to really prosper while we all suffer from the impact of the COVID epidemic. Idaho is a very safe and attractive and prosperous place to locate or to expand, and we look forward to providing you information as we move forward on this. Certainly the state data that we've all read about confirms that it seems like Idaho is on the rebound. State revenues are up, and we are moving forward. So our first slide of content. This slide tries to provide you an overview of how the system and the process works. Idaho is what is termed a Dillon Rule state. Very simply, that means that all authority and power to a local government must come through the state legislature. Thankfully, the legislature has provided local government a few tools and authority through the Local Land Use Planning Act, which allows those entities to adopt a local comprehensive plan and ultimately a zoning code and a building code. However, because all power comes from the legislature, we all know that the Idaho legislature has a tendency to impose its will on local government to change the rules over time, and will limit some of the activities that local governments can control. For example, most recently, the state legislature has determined that local government can only do certain things concerning short-term rentals, and they are constrained by those state statutes. Next slide. So this Venn diagram, I believe, provides a great overview of the operating principles of development. Provides the tenets which are important to the public sector, private sector, tenets which are common to both, and tenets which are important to neighborhood associations and other interest groups. So the comment here I would like to make is that no matter what side of the equation, or if this is a three-party equation you might be on, either the public entity charged with reviewing and approving a development plan or a development application, or the private entity wishing to achieve a particular objective, or a community neighborhood association attempting to achieve its objectives, you need to not only thoroughly understand your own particular position, but also the position of the other parties involved. Though you will always be charged with advocating your position, in this particular context, there is no real need for the process to be adversarial. From the public side and the community side, understand that sometimes there is information for a project which simply is not yet ripe for release, and certain information which, from a developer's standpoint, must remain confidential. From the private side, understand the public's right to know, the public's interest in achieving a project that is a win-win for everyone. Finally, also recognize there are very many different interests, particularly in a project of any size that is going through the development approval process. So next. So this slide wanted to really provide the concept here that on the private side, there is a long time coming sometimes before an application is actually filed. Obviously, the developer or the property owner must have a business concept. They spend quite a bit of time, energy, and money in site selection, a market study, secure financing, and then their own due diligence on a particular piece of property before committing itself to actually purchasing the property. A lot of engineering and design work goes in at the time or before the time a land use entitlement application is involved. Some localities, as you know, do have a required pre-filing neighborhood meeting. The private sector and the public sector as well should try to avoid any confrontation, but provide an opportunity for information and a meaningful dialogue on the project that's under consideration. Next. On the public side, obviously you start, and Trisha's going to go through this in quite some detail here in a bit, but the comprehensive plan is basically the planning principles that are in effect, and then the zoning entitlement, the subdivision plat, and the infrastructure concerning the project itself. Next. Neighborhood engagement, as I mentioned, is important. And I would say, and Shellen can comment on this too, most knowledgeable and competent developers understand the reasons for neighborhood engagement and to have the opportunity to try and describe and explain their development as they go through the process. And this last slide just provides all the other component parts, obviously site engineering, architectural design, preliminary bids, pre-sales, leasing, construction management. And on the public side, after the subdivision plat and infrastructure, obviously more detailed building plan review, inspections by the building department as they go along, and then finally the certificate of occupancy. So I think at this point, we are turning it over to Shellen, who will walk us through the so-called back of the napkin real estate deal. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. So yeah, that's what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go really high level about kind of try to share with you sort of what a developer is sort of thinking as they go through the process. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, and I'm going to stay sort of, like I say, high level, just to kind of put it in perspective, how there are so many different perspectives going into creating place. So next slide, please. So what I'm going to walk you through is a conceptual development. I mentioned at the beginning that my roots are in multifamily housing development, many of which were deed restricted affordable. But this example, just for ease, is really this idea of taking a greenfield development and subdividing it, creating lots, and then selling them to a home builder. So it's very conceptual. It's not based on any exact development, but it just kind of walks through the steps of the process and sort of the perspectives of all the parties. So next slide, please. So first, a developer has created their plan, right, that Ryan mentioned, and they come up with these project assumptions. And some of them are very real, hard and fast assumptions. In this example, it's an 8-acre site. They're paying $85,000 an acre, they meaning the developer. They're figuring out what that $85,000 is based on a per lot basis. If they were doing multifamily, it'd be on a per unit basis. And they're creating development assumptions saying, okay, we can create 24 lots because it's at 3 dwelling units per acre in this particular zoning area. And we're gonna assume off the cuff that this lot price, the sales price of the lot, is roughly 25% of what the builder can sell the house for. And that's the back of the napkin, but it is actual. 25% of a home cost is generally land. So a developer is taking these assumptions along with the next slide's assumptions to kind of figure out their total project cost, right? So then it gets into, planning and entitlement, whether the developer, a small firm like me, I might be doing a lot of this myself. Oftentimes on a bigger development, they're hiring planners or land use professionals to help with entitlement. So there's a cost there. Architecture and engineering, A&E, site development cost, how much is, if there's a topography issues or grading or water, drainage, et cetera, easement issues. Then offsite cost, right? If you're doing this greenfield development, in this case, for better or for worse, right? If you're doing this development, you might need to add in a stoplight or a crosswalk or additional sidewalks that are connecting this subdivision to the next subdivision. Those would be called offsite costs. Those are all relatively simple cost assumptions that are going into their total cost. And then there's this basket called soft costs. And that includes sort of everything else, right? It includes general administration, which people would look at that and say, oh, that's profit. Well, sure, it may be, but it's also keeping the lights on in your office. It's paying the people that work for you. It's, administering those contracts with your land use professionals, your architects, your engineers, any closing costs that you had when you purchased the property, any title costs that you have to clean up, deal with as you're going through the subdivision process. Taxes, obviously you own it, you pay taxes on it, and then any incremental taxes that are assessed as construction starts, not necessarily in this case, but in some cases. Marketing costs, we have to create signage, we have to create websites, or we have to hire people to do those things. Legal cost, every good developer has to have a good land use attorney. And it's important because it's complicated stuff at times. Financing cost, how much does it cost to make that debt, right? To borrow that money. So all of these go into total project cost, and they create a pro forma. And so many years in the public sector, I heard all sorts of people all over the place saying, what does that mean it doesn't pencil? What does that mean it doesn't pencil? And so what that means is that a developer's pro forma doesn't work for them for one reason or another. And a pro forma, I added this slide, it's a Latin term. It really just means by form. But my definition, which is maybe from Google, but also with a little bit of my words, is basically a set of calculations that project the likely financial return that a proposed real estate deal is likely to create over time. It's a best guess. It's numbers on a piece of paper. It is not fact, and it will change. It does change. Next slide, please. All those assumptions go into a pro forma. This is an example of quite a simple pro forma, but I wanted to show it to you. I think it does a good job of just showing sort of where money is spent and where money is made. And so across the top row is time, right? Year one, the first half, year one, the second half, year two, quarters one and quarters two, year two, quarters three, quarters four, over time. And then in the columns, we have sort of all these things that are either creating revenue above the first gray line, which are sources, selling of the lots. We're estimating 2 lots per month they're going to be sold. And then under the sources are all the uses, all the total cost, all those things, those project cost assumptions we talked about: planning, engineer, architecture, entitlement, site development, offsite cost, land acquisition, operating costs, keeping the lights on, paying our bills, making sure we can pay our own mortgage or rent or whatever. So as you can see, this is really just to show you that year one, we're spending money, right? And I don't know if you can't see my mouth. I don't know if Alexandra can show her mouse, but her pointer, if you will. But year one, right, we're spending money on planning, all these things we talked about. We don't have any cash flow, we're losing money. Year two, we sell the first 10 lots. So we've made some money in the green. We still have some costs. We don't have any planning and entitlement costs, of course, anymore, nor do we have acquisition costs, but we have financing costs. We have other soft costs. We have site development costs. We're starting to make some cash flow, but we're still cumulatively in the red. And it's not until the end of the project, in this case, after we've sold the second phase or the last 14 lots, that we've actually created not only cash flow, but also a cumulative profit. So this is really it's obviously basic, but it's to just show how there's a substantial amount of risk early on, and what happens between year one, quarter one, and year two, quarter four, in this very short-term development process really drives how a developer is thinking. Next slide, please.
Michelle, and I might just jump in
so
here.
Analyzing,
very, very quickly. So I recall a situation in Coeur d'Alene on a condominium development where the developer would not make any money until he sold the last 2 units on the 2 top floors, because up until then it was all cost to recover the expenses that he had incurred. And that's very typical in the development process.
Yeah, it is. And it's not so everybody can feel, woe is me, the poor developer in the room. It's more so people can understand why the actions they're taking are occurring, right? And it's about risk. And so it's about this internal rate of return, which is oftentimes the measurement that developers use. Not all of them use this, but it's common. And it's basically just equivalent to the interest rate that would be paid on a bank account with the same total cost in order to get the same return in the same amount of time, right? So it's equalizing total cost and return and time. Next slide. So for example, and forgive me if we have investment bankers on the line that know this really simply, but for example, if you have $1 million and you're committing, you've got a bunch of investors that are committing to a 5-year period of investment, and they're saying, we're going to give you this money, but we need a 10% annual return. They expect to invest $1 million in 5 years. They're going to get $1.5 million back. And next slide, please. Their total returns, therefore, they're going to get $1.5 million back, but it's really just a 10% interest rate. So 1 million of that was their money to start with, and the $500,000 in this case is their overall return for having their money tied up for 5 years. Next slide, please. So the IRR is a common tool that developers and equity investors use to determine if an investment is right for them. Obviously, real estate is a high risk investment class. So, a 10% return, a 15% return is not uncommon. In this example of this greenfield development I gave, we put the math in at one point, and it was a 16% return on the pro forma. So that worked for a developer who say wants a 15% yield. To put it in perspective, a much lower risk and perhaps the lowest risk investment you could ever make would be into treasury bills, which is backed by the US government. And that return is, well under 1%. A mortgage, a 30-year mortgage, I think I checked on these rates a month ago, historic lows, but at 2.75%. So the difference between all those numbers is simply risk. And each developer is going to require a different IRR based on the project's risk. So if you have a multifamily housing developer that's going out into the greenfield, single family subdivision, they're going to have a high risk because that is a type of development that they don't do. A commercial developer going into housing, a developer from Idaho going in, or from Boise going into North Idaho, you know, there's risk when you change geography, you change product, etc. Next slide, please. So impacts on returns. You know, it is not uncommon for a developer to require 15% IRR in order for them to move forward, like I mentioned. And in that pro forma calculation, they pass, right? Check the box, it works. So they go through their entitlement phase, and for whatever reason, they don't get their rezone and they're stuck at 2.75 dwelling units an acre. Their IRR has since gone down to 3.4%. And so they no longer have interest or appetite to make this deal work. It fails them. It doesn't pencil. You can just see each one of these lines goes through that. Say site cost increased by 10% because water tables are high, topography was unknown or unclear, there's the site is dirty or something, and there's some environmental impact to it. IRR goes down. Reduced finished lot prices, or just adding time to entitlement. The internal rate of return can go down, and when it fails, in other words, that developer, he or she may no longer be interested, or moreover, her investors are no longer interested, meaning that project may not be able to occur. So those overall risks, absorption period, which is the time that it takes to sell, or in a rental project, the time that it takes to rent up the apartments. Entitlements, the time that it takes for a developer to have right to do what they want to do on their site. The rate environment, this is really discussing the financial environment and interest rates, how not only how high the rates are, but also how easy it is to access that debt and equity. The construction process, there's innate risk there. There's something wrong with the drawings and something's missed, or it doesn't pass ADA inspections or electrical inspections, or cost of a particular item goes way up. There's a ton of risk in the construction process. And then next slide is the obvious risk of the market demand and conditions. And this slide is not meant to reiterate what a tough year 2020 has been, but it is meant to reiterate that there are simply things that nobody expects. COVID-19. Now, wildfires and flooding, sure, in those parts of the country, those are expectations, and those go into your project assumptions. But because of what's currently occurring, I can speak to one project I know of that on Friday, wildfire insurance was X, and on Monday, wildfire insurance was 3 times X. Just goes to show that what's happening in the world around us very much can affect a particular project. Large profit margins, significant liquidity, vast experience by all professionals, and available capital are things that are required to make a development deal successful. So I was talking, I think, you know, Patricia and Ryan and I were talking at an APA conference, and the example that I gave was, look, as a planner, if a developer walks in and is doing something that they've never done before, it's not that they can't do it or shouldn't be doing it. It's that you need to know, as the planner in the room, to talk to them like they're a beginner, because they don't have that vast experience by all the professionals on their team. So it's just something to sort of take into consideration as we in this world move around in the development world. Next slide. So that's all that I had, I think, and now I'm going to turn it over to Jessica.
Excellent job, Shellen. So about our local market and kind of in relevance to largely what Shellen was talking about. A project can take 2 years or 5 years, or, you know, if you're lucky, maybe a little less than that, but typically on the longer side of that to come through to fruition. And due to changes in circumstances over the course of a project, COVID, wildfires, just overall inventory and supply and demand, the local market changes and conditions are really can be very helpful or detrimental to a project. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just share with you all some recent snapshots on existing home sales. We all kind of see these things in the media. This is most recently from September. And the reason why I wanted to just talk about this is on this local level. Oftentimes we are, I don't want to say anti-development, but sometimes adverse to development in certain areas. And as we can all probably attest in our personal neighborhoods, that the existing home sales and the absorption rates and pricing that go with that are very important to the overall market demand. So for example, right now, existing home sales in Ada County are up 2.5% year over year, but our median sales price is up 14%. So when a developer is taking those numbers into account and doing their forecasting, if they were running their pro formas last year, we've already increased 14% year over year. Same goes for new construction. Right now in the Valley in Ada County, those are up 18% in Ada County and 14.5% in Canyon County. One thing I like to always mention too when I'm speaking with clientele and quoting market stats is when we're discussing Ada County, we all know that the north end is a very different market than perhaps Star, but they're all lumped into Ada County. So when we're looking at those numbers, it's really important to understand that the median home price in Boise, for example, may not be anywhere near what it is in Star. For example, that slide shows 405 for Ada County, when in reality, as of last week, the median list price in Boise was $536,000. Which I think when we get to Q&A, Sean could probably talk a little bit about the median income and their affordability. I think that that's important knowledge when talking about these stats. Next slide. So I want to include this slide just to show everybody, we all know that sales have increased drastically over the last few years. This really shows a great visual representation of how much of an increase has occurred since 2016 to 2020, both in existing home sales and, next slide please, new construction sales. So you can see new construction sales are currently 34% of all sales in Ada County, 37% of sales in Canyon County. Our changes year over year in Canyon County, it's up over 53%. That's unheard of. 5 years ago when developers were working on some of these pro formas and these plans of developments that are currently in play, they would have had no idea or predictions that in Canyon County that the demand for new construction would be up 53%. Next slide. So this slide is just helpful just due to the content that we're discussing, building permit filings. So as you can see, building permit filings in Canyon County are down 10% right now. That's not necessarily because there isn't demand there. I think we all can understand that there is demand there, but certain things from entitlements, from the public process of going through the development could be causing the delay in that, which again will really burden the inventory that we do have and cause an additional, influx on pricing due to the demand in those markets. Next slide. This kind of just reiterates in graphical form what we were talking about before. As you can see, the steady line trending upward in both existing homes and new construction are kind of supporting what Ryan had said early on. Our market is doing great, and I think that anyone in the real estate industry right now can attest that we're all very busy, both in the public and private sector, and working towards a very healthy market. Next slide. This slide is helpful, I think, to paint the picture for us to all understand that as the average days on market continue to trend downward, as you can see, both in new construction and existing homes, they're getting absorbed faster. Overall, this year, it's gone down drastically in 2020 from what it was a year ago. So just understanding that the days on market are important from an absorption rate calculation when developers are determining how quickly they're going to be able to sell through the product that they're developing. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Patricia, who will go over the building blocks of the planning process.
All right, thanks, Jessica. That was great. A lot of good data there. You can, with the Canyon County numbers, you understand why I'm tired. It's been very busy here. So I just wanted to kind of start off a little big picture and then get into more detail of the planning and entitlement process. So as most of the folks who are participating and watching this, you are typically live in a neighborhood in Boise. And so one of the real important building blocks are the comprehensive plan, Blueprint Boise, and the neighborhood plans. And as you probably know, the neighborhood plans typically go through an approval process in Boise and are adopted by the city council as part of as an official plan or policy recognized by the city of Boise in making land use decisions, investments, and other uses of comprehensive plans. So it's nice in Boise that there is that strong link between the neighborhood plan and the comprehensive plan. From that, zoning ordinances are an implementation tool of the plan. The plan itself, as you know, is a policy document. One required element is implementation, but it's really the zoning ordinance that really sets the plan into motion. And it's always a good check with the plan. And I know with Blueprint Boise, the city looked at the zoning ordinance, and now they're doing it again to make sure that the zoning process achieves what the comprehensive plan aspires to for the city. And then to get into more detail on the site, you look at a subdivision process. And that tends to, sometimes it's not clear to people the real difference between the zoning process and the subdivision process, because oftentimes they go together, say in a public hearing. There's developer's requesting a rezone, and they also have a preliminary plat that they want approved. But you first have to make the zoning decision. The subdivision process is merely the process to divide land, in a simple process. Each jurisdiction, and in Boise, as the largest city in the state of Idaho, has a pretty significant standard section in their subdivision ordinance that details the landscaping, signs, all of those design elements, sometimes in a plat, and then carried forward into an individual site plan that a lot of other jurisdictions don't have. In Canyon County, we have very minimal standards in the subdivision. We're just dealing with basically streets. We do have to consider in the area of impact around Caldwell and Nampa, for example, their design requirements, and we try to implement those. But basically, at the end of the day, a subdivision is creating a legal parcel of land that has perfect title. Subdivision is where you make sure all of the property lines are accurately described, where a legal description can get recorded. You know that the property has legal access to it. It is served by utilities. So, and then beyond that is really dependent on each city's requirements, as is the site plan and design too. Site plans are typically required for commercial industrial sites as well as high density. But once you get into a basic single family residential zone, you at that point, you're looking at the site plan that accompanies the building permit. So, next slide. So here, let's go into a little bit more detail. And so this slide just shows the kind of what I described, that progression from zoning to site design, subdivision and site design. So the discretion from a developer's perspective, the risk is really greatest at the beginning of zoning. I mean, because if you don't get your zoning, you're kind of dead in the water. So there's a lot of discretion there. How I've described it to some people, and the first time I tried this out, some guy jumped down my throat. I said, you're trying to make sure, evaluating a project, that it's successful. And success means, from a developer's perspective, it's going to be successful. But from a planning perspective, is it going to be successful for the neighborhood? Is it going to be successful for the jurisdiction? And so a lot of those zoning decisions, when you have to, when the decision's made and it's committed to writing, is you have to, there's various questions or findings to ensure that the project is going to be successful for the community. It's not going, it has a positive fiscal impact. It doesn't have any health and safety concerns. It's not going to create any environmental degradation and things like that. So that's the first kind of review of a project, is really is the intended use in a general sense compatible with this land, and is this the right zoning, or is there maybe a different zoning district that fits this better? So there's just a tremendous amount of discretion there, but there's discretion, but there's also in zoning decisions, there's a lot of structure. There's typically in the ordinance specific questions that have to be answered in the affirmative for the jurisdiction to approve the zone. So that's where the neighborhoods have a really tremendously helpful role of helping getting those questions answered. And that's typically in the form of their neighborhood association comments, and also comments from the association and the citizens at the public hearings. And that's where you have two public hearings. You have one at Planning and Zoning Commission, and you have one at the City Council.
Patricia, if I
yeah.
can interject, I'm sorry, I just wanted to add in, to put this into a developer's lens. That less discretion arrow is creating less risk and more certainty. So as you move through the zoning and the use permit and subdivision and site design, a developer is getting more and more certainty, creating less and less risk with less discretion, and is therefore, well underway of moving forward in a project. So by the time they're a subdivision, they're in it. They should be.
Right.
Sorry.
I just want to say, from a staff perspective, that's when everybody's the most nervous. As you're at the public hearing, it's fraught with emotion. I see Tom Laws, I think, is participating. This is where the planner's role is for everybody to stay calm and work through the process. And that's why the structure is really important to go through. But almost as importantly is to making sure all the parties are prepared to provide effective testimony to the decision maker. So sometimes I know that zoning can be discouraging to neighborhoods, but since we have plenty of time, I'll tell one little story of literally, I think it was my last day of work at Boise City, and I had the week before gone to a neighborhood association meeting. They were really concerned about a large multifamily project going in their neighborhood. And I listened, and then I finally, when you're a short timer, you kind of say what needs to be said. And thankfully, they were willing listeners. And when they showed up at City Council the next Tuesday, they were tremendously effective, because I said, you really have to speak to the specifics of your neighborhood, how it's, you can't just say no. And I really kind of gave them some pointers on how to be effective. And they the project did get approved, but there were some really important things that were said to the developer in a couple of conditions. And so afterwards we kind of debriefed, and they were feeling a little down, but I said, you got some good things here, and the council really listened to you. So that's a good thing. So just want to say, don't get discouraged because there is a lot of structure in that. But then as we go into the details, that's where the project really kind of reveals itself. And if I had more time, I would love to go revisit some projects where there was a lot of controversy at the zoning hearing. And by the time the site design and it got built, how do people feel about it after? Did they still hate it, or did they realize that they had an impact, by participating in the zoning process? So anyway, so as we go forward, then we have, after the basic zoning is set for a property, then we have, I think they're called special use permits, I think in the Land Use Planning Act. Most jurisdictions call them conditional use permits, but it's an additional discretionary review, but less discretion, as we show, on whether that particular use fits on the site. And does it need conditions to mitigate any negative or potentially negative impacts, hence the term conditional use. But it's typically a use that's considered appropriate in the district, but it may have site-specific impacts that would may require mitigation. So those are things like someone building a daycare, or so usually you see those where they're kind of a commercial use, like a school or a church, but it might be a little more intense for that district. But so it might need conditions. And in some cases, and usually it doesn't get that far, they are denied because the negative impacts are beyond any ability to mitigate. Sometimes lately, with a lot of concerns of traffic, for example, that might be the case. In Canyon County, people can get, that's why we try to have really good pre-application meetings on just their water rights and fire protection and some things that in a city you take for granted. But for the most part, conditional use permits, it's really important for neighborhood participation to really understand those more localized impacts of that use to the surrounding properties, the neighborhood. I think a lot of zoning ordinances, I think churches and schools are a good example, where, you kind of want them near residential neighborhoods, but you don't want them to overwhelm the nearby homes. So that process typically then just goes to Planning and Zoning Commission and then on to Council by appeal. So then subdivisions, as I talked about the plats, it's basically just creating parcels. I mean, once a plat is approved, it goes up to the county recorder's office. So in Boise, they go to Ada County, and the assessor creates the parcel. So they can obviously create the tax bill to go with that particular property. And all of that, that property record is then created for that. So that as buyers buy that property, sellers sell and buyers buy, all of any issues of boundaries or access or utility easements, that's already been figured out with the subdivision plat. One thing I will say to well-intentioned decision makers is when they have a controversial subdivision, they have put conditions on the plat itself, the Mylar. And we try to not do that because actually it kind of hinders those future property owners, and to undo a recorded plat note is incredibly expensive and process laden. Sometimes that's good, but sometimes some developers, I'm going to say we have an example now about 15 years ago, they put really excessive setbacks on the plat. They should have just left them in the CC&Rs. Now the people who own those properties, it's really difficult for them to even just put a shop in their backyard because they have this really excessively large setback. So we have to go through a huge application and hearing process and create a new Mylar. They had to hire an engineer just to remove the plat note from their plat. So the best way to put conditions on that is to put that with the land use decision for the subdivision, but not clutter up the Mylar. They may have thought they were appeasing things, but they really didn't think through how difficult it would be for future property owners to make a change 15 years later. So, and then the next step, kind of the final step, we say site design, but sometimes with Boise City, that's design review. And I think that's kind of more front and center these days than it was in the past. And that's really looking at the details of building placement, mass, signs, the details go on, and they really represent the guidelines that the city of Boise has adopted. Next slide. So this is kind of the, I won't go into too much detail, but it's really shows the kind of iterative process of getting a property developed. So like we started at, once you have your comprehensive plan, land use designation, and policies that support the goal for the property, and you have the zoning, and the zoning of the other properties in the area. If that's all been decided, then you want to now do something different. So you have to always find consistency with a comprehensive plan with zoning. That's a requirement of your new zoning category. So oftentimes, if you want to do a commercial zone and the comp plan has a residential designation, you have to amend the comp plan first. And sometimes that can go concurrently, but the decision makers need to have made that decision before they decide on the zoning. So the site suitability and compatibility is all analyzed as part of that review and decision process, as well as the impact on services. And for those of you who have been around when the Blueprint for Good Growth effort was going on and subsequently adopted, that really looked at the concurrency of transportation system improvements with each step of the development. So with the zoning category, it was kind of a broader sense of what roads would this serve? Is it going to overburden the roads? And then as you get into more detail of a particular development, like a plat, then there's conditions. And then ultimately at the building permit, someone's paying an impact fee. But that's an example. At the zoning level, you're looking at a little higher altitude of the impact on services. Next slide. Let's see. Okay, so with the special use permits, in Boise City, they have a lot of development types that go through a conditional use permit process. So it can be difficult to kind of tease out what's the zoning and what's the conditional use process, because they do look a bit similar in that you're still deciding or you're still evaluating whether the use is consistent with the comp plan. It's legally a little more difficult to just make a decision on the comp plan basis. There's a lot of decisions where, I'll give an example of the Fred Meyer out at Overland and 5 Mile. That went actually to the Idaho Supreme Court because I think that was still before it was in the city limits, but Ada County had approved developments at the other corners and then went to deny it. And they went, well, you can't just treat us differently. If you had consistency with the comp plan for the other decisions, you have to be consistent with us. So you can't just hang your hat on comp plan consistency at this point. You have to look at the zone to make sure that the use isn't allowed, is allowed in some fashion in the district, the zoning district. You have to evaluate that the standards for that particular use are being met by the proposal. And when I say standards, I believe it's in the Boise City ordinance. I know it is also in Ada County. We've actually created it in our kind of reformatted the Canyon County zoning ordinance a few years ago, so that even if a use is allowed, we make sure that the ordinance not only defines the use, but if there are specific standards, there's a section called specific use standards, and it sets minimum standards for that use. So beyond if it's a conditional use or by right, there are minimum standards that use has to meet throughout the jurisdiction. So that's what we mean by standards in evaluating the use. For residential project, looking at density. I think Boise's planned unit development process goes through a conditional use permit process. So it's looking at things like density, setbacks. Typically a project has to meet setbacks, or it has to get some type of variance to alter that, or get special PUD standards adopted through the hearing process. Height limits is one that I know can be controversial at Boise City, to build higher than what the zone allows. And then also parking requirements and landscaping requirements are have typically been are already in the ordinance and have to be, kind of applied to this use. And so when you take all of that, the table is, you've got to pull all those standards together and evaluate, does this work on this site? Is this suitable? And then what conditions, like I said, need to be applied to make sure it does work for the long term. Okay, next slide. Oh, subdivisions. Subdivisions, I've been doing this a long time, and they're just, to me, incredibly boring because they're not, unless the standards have really been thought through by the jurisdiction. But they're really boring, but they're really important, I guess, is because it really sets the framework for for Boise, your city. You get things, I need to add to the slide, things like block length. I don't think I've ever heard anyone except a planner at a hearing talk about the block length in a subdivision, something that mundane, but incredibly important for walkability of the project. So again, in a subdivision, you've already, now you're into the nitty gritty of literally dividing the land up into separate properties. So the issues on the table are the zoning. Does it meet the minimum lot size, for the zone that it's in? Or you have to actually find that there are infrastructure and services. We have older plats in Canyon County that still have a sanitary restriction stamped by the health district because they have not proved up their septic system typically, or finished the permitting. So there's one that has had a sanitary restriction for at least 10 years. Someone's trying to sell it, and about every few months, someone says, what does this sanitary restriction mean? We said, well, you have to complete the septic system, the community septic system, and the health district has to formally record that they have lifted it, and then we can issue building permits. So then we never see those people again. But that's a subdivision plat. That's where there's a lot of leverage from the health district and the highway district on whether they will sign the actual plat or not. So there's some risk at the subdivision level, but it's really, if there is a difficulty with an agency, it's really due to a lack of due diligence by the developer at that point. There's really not a lot of, you shouldn't be surprised at the subdivision plat level if you have an issue with a highway district or a health district. The design is going to be reflective of standards in the zoning ordinance. So where a city, or if you look at a specific plan like Harris Ranch that Boise deals with, where they have very detailed design standards that deal with block length and the street frontage, landscape lots, you name it, the type of alley design, alley widths, all the details of pulling that together is going to be decided for that project. And then obviously the title to the property, as I said, the plat is really that legal vehicle that creates legal properties. And then just the compliance with plat requirements. I got to tell you, I know every jurisdiction in the area has a checklist for preliminary plats, and we have a very detailed checklist. I mean, it's on the plat or it's not. And I bet 50% of our plats we have to return because they're missing something on the plat that's on the checklist. And I can't tell you how frustrating that is to us. One of the issues in the area that we'd like to improve is have more training, because we're all very busy. There's a lot of development happening, but some of those basic requirements of plats just require regular training of people who are new to it. Kind of what Shellen said about expertise and with everybody. And when we don't have expertise in plats, it can really unnecessarily complicate a project. And that's where the neighbors, when we have to delay a hearing, they go, well, what's wrong? I bet half the time it's an issue with the plat at one of the other agencies, and they're not able, or they need more time to comment or do a redesign or something to deal with an infrastructure issue. So we try to make it smooth. And then the site design, oops, went a little fast. Same thing. Now you're really getting into the really specific details on a property, basically one single property. And I won't read all the bullet lists there, but it's a lot of details. And I think if you really want to understand this, probably the best thing is to go on a design review committee agenda and open up one of the staff reports. And that is where it's just all laid out, the compliance with all of the design guidelines that to apply to a property. You're going to have more design guidelines, obviously, for commercial properties and multifamily, and obviously less on a regular residential project or industrial. Okay, next one. So this is, and like the next couple slides are somewhat related, but the factors beyond the control of the developer, as Shellen said with the Pro Forma, it's kind of a forecast, but then life happens, and things that the public agency can control are the process. How long does it take for a project? And I'll just say generally a project. Some application types will take faster because maybe they only take one hearing versus 2 hearings. The other things controlled by the agency are application fees, but trust me, that has not been a barrier to most, commercial type developers. That's something that we're sensitive to for just our regular homeowner customers, and they do reflect the cost of the public cost of reviewing the application and complying with all of the notice requirements for public hearings. The public agency resources and policies and regulations, and that really gets to, like right now, we're really busy, and with going to a virtual platform, we don't have long agendas. We agendize each project separately. It has its own hearing that is open and closed, and then we start a new WebEx session on the next application. So things are, we can basically at most do 4 items in the evening, a 6, 7, 8, and 9 o'clock. We haven't scheduled a 10 p.m. hearing. Don't think that would be popular with the public. But we've had to, we've already scheduled out through mid-January. And so we have worked with our Planning and Zoning Commission to add additional dates, because that time factor just is we recognize that's costly for our applicants, whether they're developers or whether they're just a homeowner trying to get a variance. So we know that's something we can control, and we try not to be unduly delay a project. The other thing I would say on policies and regulations, that I would hope in Boise that there has been a lot of work on the zoning ordinance, and I think it's been working. They've worked with the neighborhoods, and there are special overlay districts that if a regulation isn't working, and I think that's what the zoning committee will work on. Like I said, zoning is supposed to get you the city you want, and if it's not, or if you see a glitch in a project where the outcome really isn't what nobody's happy with it, it's probably an issue with the regulation that is kind of causing a bad outcome. So that's always a good thing to make note of, and try to get that resolved at some point. You can't do it in the middle of someone's application, but it's something most agencies look at. I always have a list of code improvements that we tackle every year to make it better. And then the other factors, I think, Shellen mentioned, things like COVID happen, things like lumber tariffs, and lumber supply is impacting all kinds of development projects. Financing the labor, I think Ryan mentioned that, just our, I think we saw several projects delayed in Boise because they didn't have the construction force to finish the project. And then obviously the neighborhood input reactions, and that's beyond the control of the developer, but that's really incumbent on the jurisdiction to make sure that there is substantive input from the neighbors at every key stages of the process. That's why the neighborhood meeting really early on is intended to inform the developer of what the expectations are in the neighborhood, positive, negative, sometimes tweaking it, but it's really intended to affect and provide a better application when they submit that to the city. Next slide. So this is kind of our last slide, but it's just want to kind of summarize, and this is where the other folks can chime in, but we and I think Shellen mentioned, I mean, and Ryan for sure, this doesn't have to be a process fraught with conflict. There is tension, there are disagreements, but we can all be effective in working together. Again, the goal is to have a well-informed decision be made by the decision makers. And again, something that's going to, the process should add value to the city. But to get through that, we all have to be respectful. We have to be clear. And when we say be clear, sharing information, not playing games, no gimmies or gotchas. Recognize mutual needs, and that goes from the developer recognizing what the neighborhood means and the neighborhood recognizing the goals of development. Keeping the long view vision, and again, that's where keeping the comp plan are we building the city that we want, and making sure that the zoning decision keeps that in mind, and that as the details dial in, that the project fits and can be successable. Part of this session, I think Shellen did a great job, is understanding the risk from the developer, but also how can the neighborhood be effective in understanding that and knowing how to make the project successful, but maybe not kill it. I mean, one example is the tremendous housing needs we have here, and sometimes we can get really tied up in the details of a project, but we could probably identify the shared goals of we need more housing and build on that. But I think understanding the risk is really incumbent on everybody involved in the process. And then understanding the regulations is something that I know it's front and center with a lot of people in Boise right now, with the Citizens Committee working on the zoning ordinance. And I think if people should be able to understand the regulations. I mean, when I have a customer ask about our code, I always send them the link. I said, it's on here. Read it for yourself. If you have any questions, let us know. It's, with all respect to Ryan, they're not written for lawyers. They're really, the audience for the zoning regulations really should be the citizens of the jurisdiction. And so that's, if you don't understand the regulations, you could just talk to probably any of the staff who can walk you through it, because it is a different language than what everybody uses right now. I think sometimes the best time when I've written code is I can write a draft and I give it to my husband to read. If he understands it, then I know anybody could understand it. But it's not intended to be obtuse or vague, or the worst regulations are internally conflicting with other regulations where it's just really not clear what the intent is. Those are the ones that get cleaned up a bit. So I don't know if next slide, I don't know if any of you all want to comment on how to be effective, but I think the role of the planner who's handling a case is to bring everybody together and focus on the decision that's made and making it, like I said, the most informed, the most successful in terms of fitting into a neighborhood. And in some cases, I've had anyone who knows me knows I'm pretty transparent. If I think a project is a dog, I tell the developer right away, we're going to have problems because it's just really not fair to them. But they need to know what the problems are and be given an opportunity to make it fit. So a lot of the effort, I think, at the staff, just having worked at Boise, I know one of the planners who retired a few years ago had a foothills project, incredibly controversial. He was called all kinds of names from everybody involved, from the applicant to the neighborhood. And at the end of the day, the best outcome was the people who yelled at him the most said, this worked out okay. This project was fair, and they apologized. So that's where we're kind of used to that. But that's the best compliment is at the end of the day, everybody can agree it was a fair process. So with that, I'll end. I don't know if.
Thanks, Tricia. Yeah, I'll jump in here. This is Alexandra, and I'll share some questions. I just want to let our audience know that I am having trouble opening the Q&A function in Zoom. So if you've been using that to put questions in, please just copy them into the chat box on Zoom or enter them on chat or Q&A in Whova as I can access those. So I think let's start with a couple questions about Blueprint for Good Growth. What is that, and how does it relate to the comp plan? Are they the same thing? Are they different? How do they work together? How do they play a role in all of this?
Okay. You want me to?
Yeah, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm just saying, I think I'm the oldest person. And I became more familiar with Blueprint for Good Growth. I think it started probably about 15 years ago. I can't believe how time flies. And when I came to work at Boise City in 2006, and they were just, I think, adopting the first phase. But that's where the cities in Ada County and the Ada County Highway District kind of came together to look at what we would call concurrency of the transportation infrastructure with land use decisions. And obviously 15 years later, they're still difficult to reconcile those needs. So, but there was actual documents that were prepared. There was a consultant, everybody cost shared the consultant. And the second phase was, I think, managed through Compass in a committee to continually evaluate and get those concurrency needs adopted in individual ordinances from the jurisdictions. And for the most part, a lot of those code changes were adopted. And I don't want to get into detail about everything, but everybody's kind of codes were reviewed, and everybody needed to do a little different tweaks to really focus on how does transportation factor into your land use decision. So I think the Compass website, might follow up if you're interested. And they're still out there. It kind of at the same time evolved into the Transportation Land Use Integration Project at ACHD. We called it TLIP. And that outcome of that was really helpful. That's the project that developed the road typologies in Ada County. So like if you live in the north end, you have a different street typology map for neighborhood streets versus typical suburban collectors in other parts of the city. So it actually mapped and assigned a typology to pretty much every road segment in Ada County. And then the intent of that was to have the road design reflect the character of the land use around it. So that was really something we kind of take for granted, but looking back, that was a pretty significant achievement. And an ACHD will work with the cities to amend the typologies as I think once a year. They do keep the map updated, but all of that was a result of Blueprint for Good Growth as well.
So can I just jump in to try to address a handful of the questions that we're getting? And I'm afraid I can't quite see. I think it's Diane, perhaps, that asked kind of, I think that Patricia answered her question, which is what happened to Blueprint for Growth, and someone else asked, where can we learn about it? I think that would be, Compass is a good place to point, but I assume we can also get it online at the city's website. But one of the kind of overall questions I'm getting, I think, is why is the city still proposing this zoning change when there's all these ordinances that are also coming about? And for instance, I think it was Diane, and I'm afraid I just don't know how to see her full name or his full name.
Oh, Diane Renning. Hi, Diane.
For her question is a good one. For instance, there's a new housing bonus ordinance on the P&Z calendar in November. And what's that about, especially given there's these zoning changes? And at a very high level, I'm not a planner. I don't speak planner talk. So Patricia, correct me if I'm wrong, but at a very high level, the Blueprint for Growth, as well as Blueprint in the comprehensive plan, were created after the initial zoning code, the initial zoning regulation. And so throughout the years, the zoning code has been revised and amended to try to address many of the things that the community is facing in regards to land use, as well as to address some of the comprehensive plan, which is what the zoning code should be doing, but it didn't get all of them. And so redoing the entire zoning code is a much bigger process than creating a series of ordinances or amendments that address one single thing within the zoning code. So I don't work for the city, but I bet you they would say something to answer the question of why are they doing these ordinances when they're trying to redo the zoning. I think the question would go something, or the answer would go something like, we're trying to address these ordinances, we're trying to address the challenges that these ordinances are trying to solve in a more efficient manner, so that in the time that it takes for the new zoning code to take effect, which is years, it will be years, those ordinances can become in effect more quickly. Patricia, feel free to.
Yeah, since I don't work for the city anymore, I'm happy to answer the dynamics of updating a whole the zoning ordinance. And I know Andrea Tuning very well, and the code update is in very good hands with her and with the folks there at PDS. But there's the current effort, as opposed to the one that was done after the Blueprint Boise was adopted, is a more fundamental change. And it's really a review from, do we have what we call Euclidean standards of setbacks and all of this, to a more form-based code for parts of the city, which would be something, an example of that is the Harris Ranch specific plan, where you're looking at certain blocks and there's maybe more attention to dimensional standards and design standards, and less concern about the particular use. So you have more mixed use. That was one thing with Blueprint Boise, is to create the mixed use designation in the comp plan, and then create the zoning tools, but you'll just do it at one time. A lot of, when you look at a growing city like Boise, you have tens of thousands of people that are now city residents that weren't even around, lived there when Blueprint Boise was adopted as the last zoning. So I think the new effort, there's always elements of the zoning ordinance that are good ideas and not be strung with a whole code update, that is going to take a while. But I think one thing I'd recommend is just look at the table of contents for the zoning ordinance. And there's some of those smaller density bonuses and things like that. Those are great tools the sooner you can do it, but they're really not going to affect the design detail, or it's not going to, affect a whole lot of properties overnight. The biggest changes when we adopted the zoning ordinance changes after Blueprint Boise was, adopting a new zoning map for the city. That is not a small endeavor. And that's where, where we're going to put the mixed use designation now. There's just a lot of details in that, but if there's a good idea to get amended now, go for it, and it will be folded in. I mean, I think when I was working on the code back in about 10 years ago, I probably had 10 ordinances that were adopted as I was trying to restructure and reformat the zoning ordinance. And I had to take the old format, literally move things into the new format. But I wouldn't have recommended that they stop code updates, because some of them were good ideas. New parking standard, parking maximums, for example. Let's get those adopted, and then we'll format it into the new code as needed. So hopefully that answered that.
Thank you, Tricia.
It's clean black and white, but it really is, you're polishing a stone. It's a dynamic document.
Yeah, this is a long process. There are two other questions here that I want to fit in, and then it looks like we just got another one. Diane Renee asked about the housing bonus ordinance on the P&Z calendar in November. So that might be something to ask the city, but if anyone on the panel knows about that and maybe can update on that. The second question is how a developer factors into their plans the kind of future that our children will inherit. Deborah Molnar says that does the developer understand we live on one planet and perhaps they are also responsible for what our children inherit? So how does the long-term planning and effects of development go into that decision-making process? So maybe Shellen, you can jump in there, or yeah.
Sure, yeah. So the first question on the zoning, the ordinance, the density bonus ordinance, I alluded to it and I didn't answer the question well. I think the city would say it's an opportunity to incentivize the type of development they want in a faster manner, in the sense that, like Patricia said, approving an ordinance is at P&Z and then having it read at council is a much quicker process than perhaps creating an all new zoning code. So that particular ordinance, I think I skimmed it once. The intent, what do they call it? A density bonus, or the housing bonus ordinance. It's essentially a bonus to density that allows a developer, or it really is about the development. I mean, that's also a kind of the nomenclature, right? We always say it allows the developer to do this. And it's like, well, no, it actually allows the project to do something. But the bonus ordinance, I think, I don't remember the exact math that they use, but it essentially allows additional units if they have some level of affordability in them. And I don't recall what that level is. So that the intent there is to try to jumpstart the creation of affordable units, because as Patricia and others have mentioned, it is a very difficult time for Boiseans to stay in Boise. So the other question is, does the developer understand that we live on one planet? I hope so. Yeah. I certainly hope so. I think it's a little tongue in cheek, but yes, I mean, what the buildings that we see and the places that we make stay for many years. They are not permanent in the sense that they are not going to be here 1,000 years from now, but they do really affect the lives that we lead. And I think that's an important thing for neighbors and public agencies and developers to keep in mind. And I can't tell you how many developers I know personally, locally, statewide, and in the Western region, who see their projects or their developments as legacies for their children. And I'm sure some neighborhood members will cringe at the idea of that, right? But I think it's important to understand that many developers do see their developments as ways to give back to their communities. Not all, but some.
Yeah. And I'll add to that, Shellen, in the context of the zoning ordinance is one tool to implement the comp plan. There are many others. So something like affordable housing, I get sometimes the same expectation in Canyon County that our zoning ordinance is going to save our farmland. Well, no, it's one tool, but it's not the only tool. And so things like affordable housing, there are a lot of legal restrictions of how you can use zoning to accomplish that. And so from what I observe, what's going on at the city the last several years, they're pulling out all the tools, you know. And so I look at the housing bonus is one tool. Is it going to solve the issue on its own? No, but it's an effort to do that. And as far as the maybe the environmental concern, if that's what Deborah was relating to, I know through Blueprint Boise and then through the zoning ordinance, and I think we just saw it with the demolition ordinance, that there is a real commitment to looking at the trying to make the city carbon neutral and obviously have a high standards for all the different facets of the city environment, whether it be, you know, managing the stormwater. Now the what is it called? Water renewal. I mean, just really being recycling our resources and not degrading or wasting them. And so there is a large section on that in Blueprint Boise. And then the zoning ordinance can implement some of that, but then a lot of it is implemented through the Public Works policy and the Public Works Commission. But it's everything, you know. Something like housing. It is such an important issue right now for everybody that I explain to people when I think about housing, it's factored into every decision we make. Is it going to have an impact? Can we make it better? Is there a barrier to that? But the zoning is just one piece or one part of the solution, but it's not going to be the savior. So
Yeah, one thing I would add is that there are so many limited tools.
Yeah.
And especially in Idaho, especially with property rights and the limitations, and there have been some court decisions that have really impacted the ability of local government to impose things. And so you're back to the old stick versus the carrot. And I think what Boise's trying to do through some of these ordinances is provide a little bit of a carrot that not only will withstand any kind of legal challenge, but will also take a little bit of a step in achieving the objectives that they find to be the community objectives for their city. It's a difficult one. And to respond to one other question too, is that you really can't just stop what you're doing. I mean, the only way that you can really stop is if you were to declare a moratorium. And that is a very, very high bar that really doesn't get you anywhere in the long run, unless it's a very short period of time for a very specific purpose. So I think that's the yin and the yang that everyone is facing on the housing crunch right now, in trying to come up with what is available to us to achieve that housing affordability and housing stock that we all want.
That's a great point, Ryan, and I think a good place to wrap our discussion. If there are any questions that you have that we didn't get to today or anything that comes to mind later, you can always reach us at idaho@uli.org, and I'd be happy to connect you with our panelists or other ULI resources. Thank you so much for being here and spending your afternoon with us.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.